All right, let's switch over. So, it's really my pleasure to introduce the next session, which is going to be the talk by the David Swanson Award winner for this year. So for those of you who don't know me that well, I'm Brian Bockelman. I'm here, a PI at the Mortgage Institute for Research. I've been working with the Condor team for, as Marone would say, way too long. But before I was here, I was in Nebraska, and David Swanson was the person who hired me into this ecosystem. At the time, I had a vague interest in computers, and at some point, I had a scholarship that expired, and I walked into his office and said something along the lines of, "Hey, I like computers. Do you have a job for me?" And he said, "Well, I don't know who you are, but we just won this thing called a CMS Tier 2. I'm not quite sure what that is, but if you'd like to work on it, I guess so." And the CMS Tier 2 actually started as 4 different servers on my desk as a grad student. So David was the leader of the Research Computing Facility in Nebraska, which eventually became the Holland Computing Center. He was one of the PIs for the CMS Tier 2, and eventually he was also the OSG executive director and in charge at our lovely merry band of community. And he passed away in 2019 in a really tragic car accident. So we try to honor his memory every year through this award and give opportunity for people to say a little bit about him. And unfortunately, Rhonda, his widow, wasn't able to join us in person, so she'll be doing some of the introduction for the award in just a minute. And if there's one thing I could say about Dave, is that he was a great scientist. And if you say somebody's a great scientist, you have to decide what your objective function is. And depending on who you talk to, those can mean different things, right? If you look in films and say, what's a great scientist, you kind of get the film answer of somebody in a white lab coat doing experiments and test tubes. If you look at academics and ask your provost what a great scientist is, they might talk to you about H-index or awards that they've won. If you talk to a cynic, they might say, well, it's just simply grant funding that you pull in. But I think it's, of course, a little bit of each of those, but it's also about community. It's about leadership. It's about being able to nurture and train the next generation. And that is actually something that David was excellent at, and one thing that he did very well for the OSG. He was my mentor. He did a lot of the training of me. To share a couple of anecdotes, I've ended up traveling a lot, particularly working with a physicist while I was at Nebraska, which meant a lot of trips out of town, which is hard always on your family. And so at least one time when I was driving out to the airport, or my wife drove me out to the airport on the way back. It was early in the morning, she got a flat tire. And so at least within the Holland Computing Center, if you get a flat tire and you need help and you can't get the stupid thing off and the bolts won't come loose, you call Dave Swanson. And she'll always tell the story. Not only did he come out, change your tire early in the morning when no one should actually be up, but he also did it whistling and singing a tune. That's just the kind of person he is. He was nurturing. He liked helping people grow. His daughters would babysit for my kids. In fact, David was the first person who wasn't family to hold my son in the hospital when he was born, and he really kept close throughout his life, even to the point where his daughters would babysit for us. And so there's multiple times, more than once, that would come home from an evening out when we hired Dave's daughter as a babysitter to find not his daughter at home, but to find Dave. Right? And he'd go, you know what? I talked to Sophie and she sounded tired. So I came here and decided I could just watch the kid for a little bit. And, whether it's because that was true, whether it's because he just knew that kind of tired young parents need that extra hour together and away from things, or at some level, he's just the kind of person who likes to hold a baby for an extra hour. That's the sort of nurturing person he was. So unfortunately, Dave's not with us here anymore. That's not one of the things in the universe that we really get to decide on. But I have, if I can share a quote, actually it's a quote from the Pope quoting the wizard Gandalf. It's not every so often you get a wizard quote in a Catholic document. But the quote is, "It is not our part to master all the tides of the world, but to do what is in us for the succor of the years wherein we are set, uprooting the evil in the fields that we know, so that those who may live after may have a clean earth to till." And we don't have Dave anymore, but we can till our own fields. We can carry on the legacy, and we can think of how much he cared about young people, how much he cared about the community, how much he cared about growing throughput computing, and share that a little bit through this award. So we're really happy to be able to do this every year. And we're really happy to have Rhonda. Rhonda, can you hear us? Say a little bit something about the winner for 2026. Thanks, Rhonda.
Hi, Brian. That was just so wonderful to see you. In fact, when I was muted, I was like, oh, I wish my girls were here. We'd be waiting. Hi, Brian. That was a better introduction than I could do, but I will try. That was just lovely. Thank you. I love that I get to be here with you all, even if it is by Zoom. I loved being Dave's wife, and I am so glad to take time out of my new normal to get to honor my best friend and late husband, David Swanson. In August, it will be 7 years since he was lovingly escorted to heaven, but the girls and I talk of him often and try to think what he would do or say. And then inevitably we laugh because his mind was wit and delight at every turn, even at breakfast or when things were dumb. He was really so delightful to be around. No doubt that if Dave had no doubt that if Dave had not been an excellent scientist, his PhD was in theoretical physical chemistry, his colleagues would not have admired him like they did, or asked him to lead OSG or other consortiums and guest lecture. But truly, the reason we give this award each year is because we knew he cared about us. So as Brian was talking, I thought, Brian and I did not talk, but it really must be true who he was, because I'm saying the same things. You know the saying, nobody cares how much you know until they know how much you care. Those who knew him will agree with me. That was truly Dave. As the girls and I talked about their dad, we loved how much he enjoyed bringing everyone around him into his beautiful world of science. Abigail, Sophia, Livia, and I want to encourage each of you, and especially our award recipient, Saloni, to continue to bring others into the excitement of your scientific work. The girls always thought that whatever David was doing was just like fireworks in their world because of the way he would explain it and shared it with us. He was uniquely gifted in explaining complex ideas in a way that made sense to anyone. It was really a game for him, and he was very competitive. He won every game I ever played with him, which is probably not saying that much, but well, that's not completely true because I once got so tired of losing that I cheated to win. He then asked me if I cheated. I told him, yeah, I did. He was never mean or unfair or unkind, but I'm telling you, he was in it to win it, always. Even with the kids, Candyland, it didn't matter. He was going to win. He wanted people to strive to beat him. I really loved that about him. And then finally, the girls told me that they never could tell whether Dave was the boss or the employee or just exactly who he was at our annual Christmas parties or if we were at the university. He valued you no matter what your role was at the university. I love that each year, whether in person or in Zoom, I get to honor Dave. And I hope that you will take the funny anecdotes or just the thoughts that Brian and I have, or other people, and you will really strive to be the better scientist and the better person. So with that, I want to introduce the David Swanson Award recipient this year. Saloni Bhogale recently earned her PhD in political science alongside an MS in statistics from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Oh, so she's from right there again. That's so great. Her work leverages methods from causal inference and machine learning to understand legal institutions in the developing world. Her work is supported by the National Science Foundation's Law and Science Dissertation Grant and APSA's Early Career Experimental Fellowship. Starting in the fall of 2026, she will join the Kellogg Institute at the University of Notre Dame as a postdoctoral research fellow, where she will continue her research on democracy and the rule of law. With that, let's welcome Saloni.
All right. Thank you so much, Rhonda, for the introduction. And I'm very happy at the opportunity to be able to share my work with you all today, particularly on occasion of remembering the mentors, friends, family, and community that make our research possible. So I'm very happy to be here and excited to share what I've been up to during my PhD over the last 6 years. So I'm a political scientist by training, and trying to make this work.
Oh. Classic go. Turn it on.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you. So I'm a political scientist by training, and my research tries to understand what determines the effectiveness of institutions and their ability to achieve their stated goals. And what that means is we have a number of political institutions like our legislatures, the bureaucracy, as well as judiciary, which are tasked with the unique function of performing and producing public good and improving the lives of people. And I'm trying to understand what makes these institutions work for the people that they are meant to serve. And particularly, I focus on legal institutions in the developing world, which are arguably extremely important to maintain peace, to maintain the rule of law, as well as to enforce basic human rights for the scores of people that they govern. However, legal institutions in the developing world face two unique challenges. First, accessing the courts is extremely hard. One, because the state has very low capacity. So for example, the criminal justice system in India has one of the worst police to population ratios. There are just too few people to actually cater to the growing needs of the large population that they serve. So a very likely scenario, if you try to approach the police and file cases in the Indian courts, is that the police will tell you that they have too much work that they can handle, and they do not have the extra bandwidth to take on one additional case, which is pretty disappointing for citizens in a developing country to not have their rights enforced by the criminal justice system. At the same time, somehow, if they're able to get their cases to the court, cases face massive delays in India. For example, on the right here, you see an article from the New York Times that is talking about how it would take about 300 years to clear the existing case backlog in the district courts without even accounting for the new cases that are being filed every day. And this is really these two forces, the problems of accessing the justice system and a very not well-functioning justice system is leading to problems in the legal institutions in the world. And what my research is trying to do is try to touch upon understanding what can be done to solve this problem. So these were the questions I came with into my PhD program. And right when I was starting, the Indian government had set up a massive infrastructure and digitization project to digitize a lot of these case records that in the Indian courts. About 80 million cases had been digitized and put into a public-facing platform for citizens, lawyers, and researchers to access the case records and see whether cases are stalling, what the progress of the case looks like, what the results of the hearings have been so far, and also access the judgments that the judges may have written and uploaded to the system. And I thought to myself, this is probably a gold mine for me starting my dissertation in trying to empirically try to establish what is going on in the legal system and how to make it better work for the people that it serves. So I decided in my second year, I would scrape all of this data that had been newly digitized and to start learning about about these problems and how to address them in a better way. But as I started this project, I found myself going to the libraries at UW-Madison and issuing a laptop because, of course, my own laptop was not sufficient enough to conduct and scrape about 80 million of these case records in sequence. So I found myself going to a library and issuing a spare laptop so I could run my scripts. And then I found myself going to the library again and issuing a second laptop. Then I asked my advisor for a third laptop. And at that point, I figured this is an extremely inefficient way to organize my work. I also calculated in my head, if I continued doing this, it would take about 15 years to get all of the data that I was trying to get. So I was thinking to myself, do I work with the 1% sample to make it possible, to make this project actually possible? But this was also around the time that I was reaching out to different places on campus who could help me out with this problem I was facing. So we have a data science hub at UW-Madison, which conducts coding meetings and office hours for students. So I found myself taking these problems there. And the facilitator there said, perhaps you need to talk to people at the CHTC who might help you out with this problem. And there I was, learning about the CHTC and figuring out that's probably what I need to make this data project possible so that I can answer the research questions that I was interested in. So I found myself in the beginning trying to work with the CHTC and try to learn things myself. I also figured out that's not the best way that I learn things. And through one of the flyers that the CHTC sent out, they talked about the OSG school that was conducted in 2023. And the headline was, could you transform your research by scaling your computing? And I thought, this is me. This is exactly me. And I ended up signing up for OSG school, attending the workshops. And what I walked away with after the OSG school was a working prototype of what I needed to actually execute this massive plan of assembling 80 million case records to understand legal institutions in India. So what that prototype looked like, so I started with writing scripts on Python and Selenium that would automate a web browser that would ping the server of the e-court system to get me specific case records. I then bundled this into a container on Docker, which allowed me to sort of use the software and run it on any system agnostic of the underlying infrastructure. And then I used HT Condor to actually schedule these jobs in a way that they're not overwhelming the government servers. Particularly, I used the max materialize option, I think, to stagger the release of the jobs in a way that they're enough to kind of get me the data that I need to work with, but not as quick as to actually overwhelm these systems with multiple requests. And once I had this put together, I could actually start looking at the data and understanding questions that I was interested in. And I'm going to spend the rest of the talk talking about 3 different projects that actually came out of this large-scale data collection. So the first paper, which is also my job market paper, is trying to ask, can elected representatives help citizens access the justice system? To take you back, one of the main gatekeepers of the legal system that I spoke about was the police. They're very less likely to register and file complaints when citizens actually approach them. And a typical scenario that I saw growing up in India was that if a politician would actually call the police or accompany the litigant to the police station, they're way more likely to register your complaints and actually have them enter the courts. So I asked myself, is there empirical data that I can bring to the fore to actually test out these hypotheses and whether this plays out in the real world? I focus on this one state in India, a large Western state. If if Maharashtra was its own country, it would be the 10th largest country in the world, which I could say for many of the states in India, given their large population. And I focus on the state due to a very unique experiment that the state conducted that I'll just get into a bit. The state is divided into about 28,000 local regions, which elect representatives every 5 years. So every 5 years, there are about 250,000 elected representatives that are elected from these 28,000 jurisdictions across the state, which is a large number of people who are local, who are immediately available for citizens, who citizens can reach out to for help. And I'm trying to see whether these elected members of the local body can help citizens access the justice system, can do this work of making sure that complaints and grievances actually enter the legal system. And the experiment I am able to look at in this state is that some of these villages get 7 council members who are elected to the elected body. And some of these villages, which are similar across a number of different other variables, elect 9 members to the body. And what I'm trying to ask is, does having these 2 additional elected representatives make a difference in whether there's an increased number of case filings that get registered and actually reach the courts? And I actually calculate, and I am able to measure this legal access by relying on over 3.4 million cases that are filed from the many villages across the state. Each of these cases looks something like this, with rich metadata on when the case was filed, where the case was filed from, the statutes and acts under which these cases were filed, which allows me to test whether having these 2 additional members is making any difference on the number of cases that get filed and enter the legal system. And in addition to this, I also collect data on elections and elected representatives across a 10-year period within the state, which allows me to test very minute mechanisms based on which this process could be going on. And what I find is that in this experiment, when we have the 2 additional members in a village council, it increases the case filings by about 51%. In other words, the size of the body is increasing by about 28%, but the number of cases that get filed from the village are increasing by 51%. This is a big jump, an extremely important way in which citizens are able to access the justice system by leveraging the relationships with their elected representatives to help them make sure that their disputes reach the courts. I also find, using the data on these elected representatives, that of course, if there's 2 extra people, there's more human resources available to do the work. But I also find that these 2 people are also from diverse groups. They're more likely to be women. They're more likely to be members of the marginalized groups, which further increases the likelihood of people from different communities being able to access the justice system. This is important work that these elected members are doing. And the major implication of my work is that these local democracies are very intricately linked to the quality of the legal institutions and to determine whether people are able to access justice and enforce their legal rights. This brings me to my second paper in which I use this data, which focuses on this issue of case delays in India. Cases take extremely long to process in the Indian courts. And I'm showing you some headlines of newspapers that came out only in the last couple of months, which discuss a 17-year period for resolving a case, a 35-year delay in conducting investigations to resolve a second case, and also discussions about how courts are overwhelmed, overburdened, and have a lot of vacancies that they are not able to deal with their existing caseload. And policy experts have highlighted this problem as a problem that is very serious and amounts to constitutional failure. This is a dire state of events, and in this paper, we are trying to understand what is it that could actually speed up the cases so that they're resolved quickly and efficiently. And of course, you would turn to me and say, the solution is to hire more judges and have them dispose these cases off more quickly. However, that's extremely hard for a developing country to get the monetary resources to hire additional personnel to resolve these cases. Which brought, so I thought to myself, perhaps there's something else, some other policies that could be in place that I could use to sort of help cases get resolved faster and more effectively. This took me to the district courts in India and interviews with judges, wherein I found that judges frequently move across courtrooms. They spent about 7 months in each position. What that means is a judge today could be hearing civil cases in a particular courtroom, and tomorrow they could be moved to a completely different courtroom hearing criminal cases. So they leave behind all of the caseload that they were hearing and move to a different court and start hearing different kinds of cases. Sometimes this movement is also across different regions in the country. You're literally moving your house and your family to a different court in a different part of the country, which creates huge challenges for what happens to these cases that you leave behind. On average, there's about 3 to 4 judges who hear a case during their lifetime. And because there's so many people who are hearing the same case, it leads to rehearings that need to be conducted, because each judge might have a very different take and perspective on what needs to be done and what needs to be heard for the case. So using, again, the large data that I was able to collect, what we find in this paper is these transfers of movements of judges across different positions worsen productivity. Particularly, each transfer leads to about a week of lost productivity when calculating the number of decisions that these judges are able to use. And this happens because when judges move from one position to another, they leave behind a courtroom which is not immediately filled by a new judge. Almost 2 to 3 months of vacancies are experienced by such courts wherein the cases stall and do not move at all and do not get closer to getting resolved. The implication of this is pretty simple. If judges just stay longer in the positions that they serve in and they're not moved around this frequently, it can actually increase the efficiency of the justice system without any additional cost to the state governments and the national governments. And finally, I also use the HTC computing to work on a third paper in political methodology. And political scientists often use experiments to understand how treatments work on average. We have a treatment group and a control group, and what we are trying to understand is, does a treatment work on average among the population who was giving the treatment? And I would argue that policymakers are interested in something more nuanced. They want to understand, do these effects vary across subpopulations? Are these effects different by the gender or the income backgrounds from which people come from? And I argue this is important to design effective interventions and target scarce resources through these interventions. However, our current methods that allow us to test subpopulations treatment effects involve strong functional forms. What that means is, let us, for example, if the treatment effect varies by age on the x-axis, and on the y-axis, I'm plotting the treatment effect, and you see this sort of a wave in which the treatment effect varies. The current method would say, let's fit a linear line through it and assume and conclude that an increase in age lowers the treatment effect. However, you might want to see something that's closer to the third plot, where we're seeing this heterogeneity in treatment effects, which is more flexible and varies non-linearly. And in this paper, I'm trying to test whether a new Bayesian semi-parametric method is able to solve this problem and gets us the blue line, closer to the blue line. So in this paper, we leveraged HTC to run simulation studies to understand whether this method was actually valid, whether it was producing correct results or not, but also benchmark performance against other competing methods that had come out in the last 5 years. And in order to execute this, we ran jobs of varying complexities, sample sizes, and methods across again, containerized runs using Docker to execute 1,000 runs of the same method and try to then analyze the results. And the preliminary results do show that our proposed method is both faster and leads to lower error across these simulations that we were able to run on the HTC systems. In closing, I would like to really emphasize that I've presented a range of work that looks at both how legal institutions can be improved, but also how our methodology to understand social science research can be improved. And leveraging the HTC systems in order to do this was extremely important and crucial. I think it has changed the scale of the work that I am able to do and the type of work I'm able to execute. So I really appreciate all the community that's built around it, as well as what it was able to do for this research going forward. That's all I have to present, but I'm looking forward to any questions you all might have and discuss this with you all.